NORML.org.
It's time for the Russ Belville Show's Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and a leading author and researcher on cannabinoids and health, who pins the Ask Dr. Mitch column for High Times magazine. Get your questions ready in our live chat or call in to 971-533-7111 now.
All right, everybody, 1/2 on a Monday, and that means it's time for our medicine. We got Dr. Mitch Earlywine on the line. How you doing, Dr. Mitch?
Not bad.
Having a good day myself, although I'm just getting over this terrible, terrible head cold that I got at the Seattle Hemp Fest, and I guess I needed to wash my hands more and maybe not share so much while I was there.
It's hard not to share, but sometimes it's the best practice.
Well, I'll still recover and do the best I can today. At the beginning of this segment, we always like to have some time here for people to get their questions into our chat room. While you're doing that on the chat, just type a Q: at the beginning of it, and that gives us an icon, makes it easy to pick out. Also, you can call at 971-533-7111. But we always start with Dr. Mitch telling us the latest in cannabis science. What's happening, Dr. Mitch?
Oh, Paul Armentano was nice to send a new study around from the Journal of International Neuropsychological Society, and they're trying to identify neurocognitive performance deficits in young adult cannabis users, and they're finding some in men and some different ones in women, and they're hypothesizing a lot about maybe there's some wild gender roles that fit into it and stuff like that. But I want folks to interpret this with a real grain of salt, because anytime you start fishing around like this, I have to wonder how many neuropsych tests did they actually give, and the fact that it works with some men and only other ones on women makes me have to wonder how many statistical tests did they actually run before they published this paper. So I wouldn't make a big deal out of this. We've always talked about how, marijuana is not for teens, and that's fine, but I wouldn't make too much of a big neurocognitive performance in young adults when they've run this many tests on this many people.
You mentioned that the sample difference in gender. Is there a big difference between men and women when it comes to some of these neurocognitive disorders and tests?
Well, literally 2 years ago, my student Allison Luby did something comparable, and she told the men and women, hey, these are going to be really sensitive to your cannabis use, or she said, hey, these aren't sensitive to cannabis use at all. And the women actually reacted in the opposite way. So if you told a woman, hey, you're a pot user and you're going to show deficits on this test, they immediately essentially said, sure, bitch, and started doing even better. So okay. I think that, the moral don't mess with women who smoke pot is certainly one you want to keep in mind. And I just feel like that's something we want to think about contributing to each of these kinds of performances, because it's never the same test over and over again. It doesn't seem like the cannabis-related deficits are showing up on the exact same cognitive functioning issues, and so I'm always a little apprehensive about it.
Well, that study, all that information dovetails well into a question that we got by email. That's another way, folks. If you want to get your questions in, you can go to our 420 Radio contact page. Bo asks this. He's asking about the luminosity or lumosity brain exercises, and he says, on several occasions I've completed the training for the day, then get high and take the test again. Each time I do this, my scores are higher after smoking. Is this normal?
Well, in fact, a lot of those are cognitive tasks where practice is a big issue. So he'd obviously have to go on again and get high first and then try it after he comes down to sort of see if it's practice or if it's a cannabis effect. And then some of those tests are really kind of odd in that they are timed, and so they kind of induce anxiety in folks. And if the cannabis is decreasing that concern, it's funny how it actually can facilitate performance on some of those timed power type tests.
Interesting. All right. We have a question from our chat room. Runaround 666 wants to know, if someone gets an anxiety or panic attack from cannabis, can giving them a high CBD strain help to counteract the panic attack? Pharmacologically,
that makes some sense. But I think people who are having an adverse reaction to cannabis saying, hey, the cure is more cannabis,
smoke this
is
instead.
a little bit of a hard sell sometimes. I find if you give somebody just a Benadryl or an antihistamine that's mildly sedating and put them in front of the cartoons, they usually do fine.
All right. And good question, 666. Very, very interesting. Now, in the news, we talked today about Senator Patrick Leahy calling together a commission to discuss the war on drugs and its impact on, the budget of all things. We've also seen that drug czar Kurlikowski's on the way out, and I've seen some people lobbying, or I saw mention that maybe the next drug czar ought to actually be a doctor. And I'm wondering if you think that's possible. Do you think that the next drug czar nominated could be a doctor? And given the way the position is described, having to oppose legalization, could a doctor in good conscience take the position?
I'm apprehensive about an MD taking it, not because I think MDs wouldn't be good, but I think the MD they would pick would be such a hard ass that it would be worse than having a cop. I mean, it's funny how it's like, Nixon can go to China and not be called commie. If an MD is going to be drug czar, he's going to have to be super hardcore, all, into treatment and enforcement and stuff like that, so he doesn't get called soft on drugs, essentially. So I'm really kind of cautious about it. I'd much rather see Ethan Nadelman, somebody who's clearly on our side, who has a PhD and is neither cop nor physician, but maybe the policy wonks just aren't going to get their turn.
Yeah, and in that piece, it was suggested that a doctor like Dr. Nora Volkoff would be a selection. So there's your example.
I mean, that's a complete nightmare as far as I'm concerned. She's been at NIDA trying to develop a vaccine against addiction. And this, drugs are a brain disease model has just really, at least, driven me completely crazy.
And that is something we hear, discussed many times. Addiction, we should treat drug abuse as a health concern, and a part of that is people calling addiction a disease. I know when I was growing up, my father was alcoholic, and they said it was a genetic predisposition, and people that are predisposed to it, if they try it, they'll have more chance of addiction. Well, what's the truth behind that? Are we talking disease like a disease you can catch or pass on to someone, or how does that definition hurt or help to discuss this issue?
I think if you think about the history of when the disease model actually hit, before that was this kind of moral weakness model where basically you were addicted because you didn't have enough willpower and you basically didn't go to church enough. And I mean, it was really creepy before that. Okay. And then people were blamed for having it. So it was a rough model, and the disease model was a really nice step in the direction of helping people understand that nobody's doing this consciously. Nobody wakes up when they're 6 and says, "Gee, I want to grow up and be a crackhead." It just doesn't work that way. I do feel like the behavioral interventions have taken it a further step and said, you know what, this is a learned behavior, a lot like any other learned behavior. We do inherit dispositions and tendencies to react in different ways to certain substances and certain activities. That part's heritable, but then what we do with that is what we have control over. And it's not a disease like anthrax or something like that. And if the disease model works for you, by all means, go for it. But let's treat this like something we can unlearn, just like we unlearn other bad habits.
All right. Another question from our chat room. Howdy Y'all wants to know, are you aware of studies on differences between outdoor grows and indoor grows? And if so, what has been their focus?
It's curious because they don't get to publish a lot on things like that in the mainstream literature. So there's a lot of lore, and, our pals, Danny Danko and folks like that really are on top of that. What I have seen is more stuff that's focused on amount of light and temperature and things like that, things that can be more easily controlled indoors, and those go pretty much the way you'd expect, with hotter and more light making for more THC and a lot more resin.
All right. There was a story that came up last week in Rolling Stone. Can marijuana improve your emotional state? And the subhead says, study says THC could play an important role in how we process negative emotions. This is some study that came from the Journal of European Neuropsychopharmacology. There's a $12 word. And has to do with endocannabinoids and how we process negative emotion. What are the impacts of this study, and what does it mean for how we might treat people?
The hypothesis is that there are two brain parts, the amygdala and the hippocampus, that are really involved in how a lot of this works. And the hippocampus is very much about memory, and the amygdala is very much about extreme arousal and emotion. And when they are communicating with each other, okay, that's delightful. But during trauma, they can really sort of overpower each other, and then the memories end up riding the amygdala in a way that's maladaptive. When it's no longer time to be aroused, it's simply just a cue from something that was similar to the trauma. The endocannabinoid system, as we know, can essentially hit all those cannabinoid receptors in both areas, but the hippocampus is particularly rich in them. And so here's an opportunity to essentially have the memories and the cues show up without all that wild arousal going on in the amygdala. And then the hope is, with repeated exposure this way, some of that arousal might dissipate even in the absence of cannabis.
You know, we talk a lot about the lack of studies that are granted to show the benefits of cannabis, and how National Institutes of Drug Abuse funds studies to find what's bad about cannabis. John Thomas from our chat room brings up something that I'm glad he did, because he reminded me of this. I saw it this morning, where National Institutes of Drug Abuse have been giving a $1.86 million grant to study the effect of marijuana on domestic violence. John Thomas wants to know, where in the world are they getting this approach?
I mean, I'm so flabbergasted by that, I don't even know where to begin. And nevertheless, it sort of shows what happens. So you can imagine when I submitted a grant that week about cannabis and improvement of PTSD, what a surprise. Mine didn't even get opened, and that one suddenly got over $1 million.
Wow. This is just insane. Do we have any previous studies or information on a link between cannabis and domestic violence?
No, see, it's all this, let's take what we found with alcohol and apply it to cannabis.
Yeah.
So we have tons and tons of data that show that alcohol not only increases domestic violence, but you can be mad at someone else and basically kick your dog and your kids and your wife after alcohol. So, I mean, it's really a spooky drug as far as that's concerned. And I'm sure, these researchers are doing the best they can, but you take those same models, plug in marijuana, and hope the reviewers are going to buy it, and apparently they did.
Will this backfire on them and show that there's not a link and maybe even a disassociation between marijuana and domestic violence?
Well, and then the sad part is, their pressure will be to not publish that, or to find one small negative thing where, the people smoking marijuana reported more irritability, as if, a 5 means more than a 5.2,
yeah.
Something silly like that. And then they'll publish that part alone, and then they'll do everything they can to try to get more money to follow it up.
Oh, boy. All right. Well, we will keep an eye on that and let everyone know what gets reported, if anything, on that study. I know marijuana mellows me out. I cannot see it increasing domestic violence in any way. Ask any cop who's responded to a domestic violence call. Hey, Dr. Mitch, thanks for joining us here every Monday. We'll be back again next Monday. If you didn't get your question in, visit our chat room or send it to 420research@gmail.com. Talk to you again, Dr. Mitch.
Get well soon.
Thank you, man. When we come back, more video from HempFest.
We'll be right back after these messages from our 420 friendly sponsors. Support these advertisers because their ad money goes straight to the Russ Belville Show. You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.
Cast your eyes up to the skies. More easy to live and die.